Well, hello there. This episode is sponsored by no one. That's it. SpongeBob SquarePants. Wow, a character known and loved all over the world and has quite a few games. Like one of my favorites, SpongeBob Tickler. I'm not even gonna be. Watch this. Watch. Ay caramba. Thank you, app. But of all the SpongeBob games, some might even go as far as to say of all licensed game in general, there is one that stands supreme. It is the one, the only, the classic. SpongeBob SquarePants Battle for Bikini Bottom. A childhood classic of mine that I really need to wash off now. This game was a staple of my childhood. I played it so many times. So I am honored to say that this video on its development was brought to you by the original devs, who were kind enough over several months to answer some of my burning questions about the game. Like, where did it all start? Why did certain things get scrapped? What about the ice cream dream? What's the deal with Muscle Bob? Or what about text with seemingly no meaning? What is the meaning of it? And if you have no idea what I just said, that's perfect. I'm going to explain everything in this video. And if you do know what I said, there's still some new info coming straight from the devs. So on this episode of Beta64, I'm going to bring to you this video on the development of SpongeBob SquarePants Battle for Bikini Bottom.
Development of Battle for Bikini Bottom began just as Heavy Iron Studios was finishing up their current project, Scooby-Doo Night of 100 Frights. So that'll be around mid-2002, meaning that Battle for Bikini Bottom was only in development for roughly 1 single year, which was really only possible because it was built on the same engine that Night of 100 Frights used. Shiraz Akmal was the director for both of these games, and I was lucky enough to get into contact with him for this video, so seriously, thank you for that. During our messages back and forth, he recounted the exact moment that he learned he would be directing Battle for Bikini Bottom. Now imagine this, Lau Hall, who just came on as general manager and would later run Heavy Iron itself, was having lunch with Shiraz and the soon-to-be corporate producer, Petro. This was all going down at a Thai restaurant in Marina del Rey known as, and I'll try my best to pronounce this, Sean Duret. I tried to find a photo of the place, but they closed down around 2006 and was replaced with a high-rise, so I literally couldn't find anything. It's a tragedy, really, but anyway. During lunch there, Petro asked them if they'd be interested in taking on SpongeBob SquarePants as their next big project. And of course they said yes, and very soon after that, because they were just so freaking excited, they began working on what would become Battle for Bikini Bottom. Now, they needed a plan to get this done ASAP, and part of that plan was having the levels created in waves, due to the limited amount of level designers on the team. Kelp Forest was included in that first wave of 3, but before that first wave even started, Joel Goodsell, who had just been hired as the game's lead designer, began working on the game's first level, Jellyfish Fields, while most of the team was still finishing up Night of 100 Frights. Each of Battle for Bikini Bottom's levels had to go through a few steps before they could be considered complete. Concept art, basic level layout, first pass, and then a second pass in art and design. Now, you know here on this Beta64 show that we love concept art, and while the game does include a lot of viewable art in the theater, a lot of which is scrapped robot enemies like bug robots, flying shark robots, robot townsfolk, and even a giant robot that was meant to destroy the entirety of downtown Bikini Bottom, the best way to view concept art is on Heavy Iron's website. Or at least it was, until the art got taken down for unknown reasons. And while a good chunk of it was saved, there's quite a few that were lost to the sands of time. And speaking of sand, let's start with Sand Mountain, which shows SpongeBob riding some clam lifts to the top of the mountain in order to tongue slide down. And yes, I will have to say tongue slide multiple times in this video. We're both just gonna have to get used to it. This isn't really anything out of the ordinary. SpongeBob tongue slides all the time for some reason or another. But what we can see that's not normal are these shiny objects, which instead of looking like flowers, look like jewels here. We've also got some art of Rock Bottom, with a nice look at some early Sleepy Time robots, plus a default wooden tiki that's apparently asleep, much like the tikis are known to do. And I guess it is possible that this is an early tiki, just with the design of a wooden tiki that didn't make it into the final game. And speaking of not in the final game, take a look at these enemies over here. From the looks of the area, these giant fish may have been meant for Rock Bottom, but I'm not 100% confident on that. You'll also notice that SpongeBob has some Mermaid Man gear on, even though in the retail build, SpongeBob never changes out of his regular clothes. Though I will say, in the game's concept art section, there are full-blown models of this too, along with a prehistoric SpongeBob that was also scrapped. According to the developers, these were meant to be unlockable costumes just for, funsies. And even though they weren't added to Battle for Bikini Bottom, they were brought back for the team's next game, the SpongeBob SquarePants movie, which included both of these scrap costumes with new, sleek designs. But what about something that never got a single model made for it? And I'm not talking about just costumes, I'm talking an entire world, Glove World. Now I know what some of you are already typing in the comment section. Andrew, that's not true. Glove World was modeled and used in the game. It's called Goo Lagoon Pier. See, it's both on a beach. These are rides and carnival things, and it's on a pier. So it's like the same thing as this concept art, right? Well, to be honest, I don't blame you. I thought the exact same thing too. That is until Joffrey Black, one of the game's artists, went on record saying that Glove World was never developed past the concept art phase. And he would know. He worked on Goo Lagoon Pier himself. He created the tents and the signs and other props like that. He does go on to admit though that the pier most likely came from the idea of Glove World, but less like, let's put Glove World assets into Goo Lagoon, and more like, let's scrap Glove World completely and just use that idea of a carnival setting in Goo Lagoon. Glove World isn't just referenced in this concept art though. It can be found in the final game, referenced in an early unused menu in the game's files, which sadly when loaded into the game still has the final menu on top of it, so it's kinda hard to see. But thanks to this recreation, we can get a much better look at it if we scroll all the way down. Yeah, there it is, Glove World. This menu also features task names in Spanish for some reason, as well as some early pineapple arrows that were replaced with jellyfish, and some 2D spatulas that were eventually made into 3D models. There were other places that were scrapped too, but unlike Glove World, these didn't get any concept art to my knowledge. This info actually comes from the SpongeBob Complete Season 3 DVD of all things. In it, there's a fun facts option for a couple episodes, and in the No Weenies Allowed one, towards the end, it says, getting into the salty spittoon is one goal of the SpongeBob game Battle for Bikini Bottom. And it continues on saying that another goal was to destroy Weenie Hut Jr. Now, I never heard of that before I was DM'd about it by YouTuber Crispy Bacon, so I decided to ask Shiraz, to which he replied, not sure. To quote him exactly, Shiraz said, we wanted to include as many characters and locations as possible, but cut so many of them due to time, resources, etc. So yes, it is possible that it was planned at some point early on, but if it was also scrapped so early that nothing was created for it. But my question is, how on earth did the DVD know that? Like, why did it state it as if it was fact? This DVD came out 2 years after the game, on my birthday to be exact. Now, the episode that this fun fact shows up in aired a year and a half before the game's release, so it's possible that they were working on this DVD for a while, but it's still a mystery as to how this obscure info made it into the final DVD release. Now, technically, this could be referencing the Game Boy Advance version of Battle for Bikini Bottom, which does have the salty spittoon, but pink. But you still can't get into it like the DVD says, and there's no Weenie Hut Jr. either, so it's still scrapped. Now, back to the concept art, following in the same footsteps as Glove World, we've got Robo-Squidward, a scrap boss for the game that only appears in concept art. Nothing was made for it, and I genuinely wish I had more to say about this. I mean, it kind of appeared in the Game Boy Advance version, it was brought back and rehydrated, but it's unknown where it was meant to be in the original version, if they had even planned a place for it to be to begin with. It's a mystery. And so is this next piece of concept art, labeled as Jellyfish Fields on the cutting room floor, but from the looks of it, it seems more like Kelp Forest. Even a couple of the devs weren't entirely sure where it was, but were leaning towards Kelp Forest. The problem is that if it is Kelp Forest, what the heck is this peanut butter? If it was Jellyfish Fields, I could see it as being an early ointment for Squidward's stings. I mean, the image is called Peanut Butter Antidote. There are a lot of mixed signals here. It looks like Kelp Forest, logically makes more sense as Jellyfish Fields, and the devs I talked to have no idea. I'm just gonna move on from this, and maybe something else later on will give us a hint. So, moving on, let's look at this last piece of concept art that I wanted to show you. It's for Patrick's Dream, one of the most infamous scrap levels in Battle for Bikini Bottom's history. And it still exists in the game's files, though, of course, unused. This level is playable and was built on July 23rd, 2003, and it's missing a skybox, so it makes things a little hard to see. Let me put a template on real quick. There we go, much better. This ice cream dream features Mrs. Puff at the beginning, who you can't talk to, followed by Sundays to jump on, cherries, onions, and pickles to avoid, and a long line of enemies that just stand there, menacingly. You can get them to attack you if you stun them first, which will cause them to revert to their attacking phase once they recover. Let's just leave them be for now. We don't want them to attack us, so we can focus on that golden spatula on top, which for some reason is internally called Bubble Wand. I don't know why. SpongeBob is one with a bubble wand. Maybe you collected a bubble wand, but that's really stretching it. I have no proof of any of that. Now, for those of you who don't know, this stage was completely replaced with the Enigma of Patrick's Mind in the final game. But this ice cream stage does have a link to the final stage, meaning that they both may have been connected at some point, or at least both been planned to be in the final game. Now, I don't know that for sure, but I do happen to know why this level was scrapped in the first place. According to Shiraz, it was simply a matter of the team running out of time and budget. So what's simpler than a literal void? And that's what they did.
There are a couple more levels besides Patrick's Ice Cream Dream, but we'll get to those later. Instead, let's head over to May 15th, 2003, which happens to be E3 time. And during that time, IGN uploaded some footage of an early build of Battle for Bikini Bottom, which shows like a lot of changes, some of which are still in the game's files. So let's take a look at that.
No! Okay, it's fine. I found a backup of the video before it was deleted. That is something that I always feared would happen, and I never thought it actually would. Jeez Louise. Here's that B-roll footage, which starts us out in SpongeBob's house. But before we look at that location, check out that HUD. Oh, every single icon here is different. The spatula, the shiny objects, which were quite literally random shiny objects with the word shiny object written on them. Then we got these, undie pants, which are unused in the game's files, along with the spatula and a random anchor, which appears in the spot where normally a level-specific collectible is, like how in downtown Bikini Bottom there are wheels there, or in Kelp Forest it's the campers. So I guess that means there were originally anchors that you needed to collect, but unlike wheels and campers, it wasn't limited to one location. The anchor counter appears in other levels too, like Sand Mountain. Plus, it doesn't even have a set goal of how many to collect, like all the others in the game do. So maybe this was supposed to be like socks, where you collect a bunch throughout all the levels in the game? Or of course, it could just be a placeholder. Now, with the HUD done, let's check out SpongeBob's house, which lacks any of the damage you'd see in the final game. But how are we going to compare this to the final version when it's already destroyed by the time we can even move around? Easy. We can compare it to the intro cutscene, which shows what SpongeBob's house would have looked like before all this happened. Just do a little free cam work, and there we go, that's pretty good. The thing is though, the only thing that's really different here is Gary's photo and the chair were moved to the other wall. But what's really interesting is what's on the chair. It's a sundae. A smelly sundae to be specific. You know, the one with ketchup, onion, the plant, the classic. Turns out that sundae was originally going to be a power-up in the game. But how do we know that? I mean, SpongeBob never picks it up in the footage, or any other footage for that matter. Well, that's because it's still in the game's files, and its functionality is there too. So this is the sundae I put back in the game, and as you can see, it's rotating nicely. If you collect it, you get super strength, enough to break stone tikis, plus you get stinky breath, and you can run quite a bit faster. And speaking of running faster, if we go back and check out that early footage, you'll notice that SpongeBob's running animation is faster than the final version. And he even plays the running for your life animation since there's a hammer in here, which is weird because there shouldn't be a hammer in here. Also, Gary doesn't belong over there either, and that Gary sign, despite it being adorable, was removed and replaced with a simple moving question mark sign later in development. Heading back into the kitchen, it's got the same general layout except for the sign moving, and there's also no typewriter for Mr. Krabs to speak through, which I never questioned until now. How the frick does he talk through a typewriter? Not to mention, the window over there is smaller in the early footage, and so is the beach ball underneath the table. Though it's kinda hard to see with those chairs being in a different position. Other than that, the missing cabinets and a different looking shelf, that's pretty much it for SpongeBob's house. Though I should say that this shelf here is still in the final version, just out of bounds so we can't see it. Now what about Squidward's place? Well, pretty much nothing changed. Other than the music stand moving, the talk box and the talk button prompt not being there, and the tikis being gone, though I guess those could have been just destroyed earlier. The biggest change here is the fact that Squidward is wearing his uniform in his house. How about we go outside and check out Bikini Bottom next, which requires SpongeBob to go through an early toll gate, which by the way is still in the game's files. But for some reason, the toll gate is both opened and closed. Weird. There's a lot of weird stuff in this footage, and mostly I attribute that to it being an early development build of the game, not really fit for the public to play. I will say though, this is direct feed footage from E3 2003, But the game itself was not shown on the show floor. Instead, it was like tucked away in the corner, more or less. What I'm trying to say is, despite this build of the game being available to play, it was not a polished E3 build. It's got a lot of oddities. I mean, seriously, look at all this nautical nonsense. The hammer spawns back immediately after destroying it. The player just sometimes doesn't get hurt even though they clearly should. Text is thrown on the screen to tell you to press the button, and SpongeBob straight up falls through the world. Not to mention, look closely in front of the Krusty Krab. There is a line of tens, hundreds maybe, probably not hundreds, but a lot of golden spatulas. Why? I mean, maybe, just maybe, the golden spatulas you collect were supposed to show up here so that way you could see your collection, but personally, I don't think that was the case. I think they're just simply here for debugging purposes, and they just decided not to take it out of the very in-development build they showed off at E3. And speaking of development builds, did you know that's where this SpongeBob power-up came from? According to Jason Horner, lead programmer of Battle for Bikini Bottom, this transformation came from a specific debug build of the game where the player could control a boulder, rolling it around in order to test the physics engine. And it turns out it was way too much fun to play around with, so the idea was pasted onto SpongeBob and added into the game. Now, before we move on to a different area, let's finish looking around the Krusty Krab. And as you can see, the place is pretty empty. Mr. Krabs, Plankton, Bubble Buddy, none of them are here. The flags in front of the Krusty Krab, missing. The Chum Bucket Robo headquarters sign, gone. And just like in SpongeBob's house, there is no robo damage to be found. Also, where the frick is the taxi pickup spot? Like anywhere in this footage. How'd you get to levels in this build? Wait, hold up. I see a little gate over there. Guess that's how you got to the Dutchman's graveyard, but that doesn't really explain why it's not at Sand Mountain. Probably had to quit the level through the menu or something to get out, but that's just speculation. I would like to take a look at Sand Mountain though, which surprisingly doesn't look that much different, except for the massive amount of tikis here that aren't animated. Plus there's no Squidward to be seen and no taxi pickup spot, of course. Further down in this area, you'll notice this poor destroyed snowman, or I guess Sandman, moved over onto the ice. And also the Robo Duplicatotron was pushed over to the right. And check out what happens when Sandy gets close to it. See that green arrow? That was later replaced with a hand pointing to the object or enemy that Sandy can grab with her lasso. But here's the thing about that. She can't grab the Duplicatotron with her lasso in the final game, which was probably changed because it would be way easier to destroy the machine, and they wanted to make it a challenge. What else? But we do get to see a really nice look at these early shiny objects, which don't gravitate towards the player when walking near them, or even when destroying a tiki. There it simply flies up to the counter all by itself. Further along in this footage, Sandy then attempts to beat Larry's best time on the slopes. But no one's here to watch except Larry. Not even the tikis. The only thing that's here is the environment, which is pretty much the same. Really, the only thing to note here is that Sandy used to slide on her tail rather than on a shell. Other than that, some missing signs, it's pretty much the same. Now over to SpongeBob in the Flying Dutchman's graveyard, who's using his bubble moves to take down the Flying Dutchman himself. Mr. Dutchman, sir? Oh yeah, that's right, you just talked to him at the beginning, not fight him. But to be fair, you usually talk to him back there. I guess they moved him over just a little bit, so that way when you walk through the entrance, you can see that cutscene introducing our new Robo friend. Going back to where SpongeBob is fruitlessly attacking the Dutchman, some of you perceptive viewers may have already noticed that SpongeBob's bubble attacks changed. You know, the one with the feet going... Yeah, here they're shoes, not feet. And the Viking helmet, well before that, it was just kind of a generic helmet. Next up, the Myrmilator entrance area, which like Sand Mountain is missing its props. But Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy are here, so that's cool. Doesn't look like SpongeBob can talk to them, but I'm sure that was just gonna be added in later. Now SpongeBob's model, which is shown very nicely here, is ever so slightly different from the final version, just in the fact that he doesn't really smile. This model is also in the final game under the name 12803 SpongeBob Bind, which stands for January 28th, 2003. Now, besides SpongeBob's model, there also happen to be changes to the Myrmilator itself. Some differences here include lots of steam, and the dance floor, which normally is supposed to cycle through its panels automatically, in this footage it only changes when the player jumps. Either that or it's extremely slow in this version, and by some strange coincidence it only changed when SpongeBob jumped. Now why don't we check out Patrick, who's fighting Wow, she's fast in this build. And he's dead. I guess they didn't really have a death animation yet, so the screen kind of just fades out and back in. The arena here is definitely much more basic, but of course that's not really much of a change as much as it is they were working on it at the time. And since we've seen one Robo Boss, might as well see another. Like Robo Patrick. Wait, where the frick is he? All we've got here is this extra dense steam and some random robot enemies that aren't even functional yet. And what the heck are they even doing here? Patrick's the only robot that's meant to be here. Well, I guess we got to at least see SpongeBob's early bubble wand attack, which produces way less bubbles. Next up, Kelp Forest. And the first thing you should definitely notice is that it's not nighttime here. Though according to Joffrey, this wasn't intended. The footage was just taken before the lighting passed. Still, it's nice to see the place a little bit brighter than we're used to. But we don't really get to enjoy too much of the area since the footage spends the entire time filming Patrick fruitlessly fighting tubelet enemies that he can't hurt and he can't get hurt by. Well, I guess that's not entirely true if they use their giant freaking laser attack, followed closely by their giant freaking explosion attack, all of which looks very unfinished. This whole battle takes place near the very beginning of Kelp Forest, where you meet up with Mrs. Puff, but she is nowhere to be seen. But you know who can be seen? 3 different ARF bots, all in this one small area. See? 1, 2, and 3. They are not supposed to be here. Alright, let's check out that Goo Lagoon next, shall we? Alright, good way to start. SpongeBob has now returned to us from the clutches of death thanks to Hans, who is coming from the top of the screen instead of the right, by the way. Now we can see a good look at the beach. No, SpongeBob, do not fall through the floor. Okay, rewinding. Here you can see that despite a ton of missing props, enemies, characters, it doesn't look all that different. We do get to see a stone tiki, which isn't supposed to be over there, and there's also a thunder tiki over to the right, 3 to be exact, that's both an early design and blue for some reason, sitting right by a blue chair that was made green later. And you know, since SpongeBob fell through the world, we can also check what's under the world and compare it to. And it's pretty much the same down here too, of course. Well, actually, those poles over there, those are in the final game, yeah, but they don't appear from this location, since the final game hides objects that are far enough distance away from the camera in order to save on resources. See how it fades out the further I move away? Well, that's how the final GameCube build does it, which means one of 2 things. 1, this whole fade out, fade in system wasn't implemented to the same degree in this early build, or 2, this early footage shows the Xbox version of the game, which allows objects to start appearing way further ahead than in the GameCube version I'm used to. But there's a problem with that. This isn't the Xbox version. IGN labeled this footage as PS2 gameplay, and after some thorough testing, it turns out that the PS2 and the GameCube versions fade out assets at the exact same distance away. So that means it's confirmed. This build just doesn't fade out objects nearly as much as the final build does. Now, something very interesting related to this is that some characters in the game have unused LOD models, or level of detail. These models are supposed to replace the highly detailed ones when the object or character is too far away that extra detail doesn't matter. But because they fade out before that in the final build, or at least the GameCube version of the game, they never get seen by the player. But we don't really have to worry about that fade out in this early footage. From the top of this tower, we can see nearly everything that this beach has to offer, including this intense animated water. Other than that, well, look for yourself. There ain't that much different here. Though the water does recede enough in the E3 build to show off a removed sandy area for the player to walk on. There's one more glaring difference though that you've probably already noticed. The watermelon was originally a soccer ball. But why? Well, according to Joffrey, it was simply because of, haha, funny, it's a soccer ball, haha. It was not planned to be kept in. Before we leave this area though, SpongeBob does take a few moments to show off his cruise bubble, which has no animation and includes a very hard to see filter place on the screen, which I thought was scrapped, but it turns out it's actually in the Xbox version of the game, though it's not nearly as difficult to see through. Also, despite hitting the robot down there, nothing happens. That is until the bubble hits the ground, which results in an explosion, which causes the robot to fall apart, which presents SpongeBob with some shiny objects. And speaking of robots, if you look closely down there, you'll see some monsoon enemies, which do show up for the first time in Goo Lagoon, but instead of flying, here they walk on the ground with their umbrella. Okay, we're a little over 20 minutes now and just about getting to the end of that first early footage, but we still have one more area to look at, Jellyfish Fields, where we get to see Patrick open a shiny object gate, and I know it's called that because it's written on the thing. This happens to be one of the earliest versions of the gate and was obviously a placeholder. In the game's files, there's another version of this object, but as a donation box, and that was ultimately also scrapped in favor of a simple clam design, calling in a transport plane to drop the bridge down to allow the player to cross. Now, here's something interesting to note. Patrick shouldn't be here. You start Jellyfish Fields as SpongeBob, right? And the bus stop to change to Patrick isn't until much further in the level. So yes, I guess technically you could backtrack to this area as Patrick, but the gate would be open if that was the case. Also, for some reason, the gate doesn't take away any of his shiny objects. And not to mention, Patrick himself gets shiny for a bit after walking through the gate, and I have no idea why. Patrick also has a couple of other miscellaneous changes too, the most apparent of which is instead of his signature belly attack, he freaking hardcore headbutts into the enemies. Very metal, I like it. But it's not just Patrick who appears in this footage of Jellyfish Fields, we've also got SpongeBob running around near the start of the level. And it looks pretty much the same, except for tons of white sea urchins, as well as that area back around the trees. Plus, if you look closely, you can also see an early flying Tiki over there with big ol' lips.
Now this early Tiki is still in the game's files under the name Tiki Lovey-Dovey, but it wasn't used in favor of a more generic design, and the reason for that, according to one of the developers, was because Nickelodeon had a problem with sex appeal on their Tikis. There also happened to be some unused voice clips of SpongeBob, Patrick, and Sandy reacting to the appeal.
Way too much makeup.
That's pretty high up.
It's almost too pretty to break. Almost.
Now some of you cheaters out there may remember that last voice clip because it is used in the game when using one of the cheat codes in the pause menu. Alright, so I've got the game booted up and we need to unlock the Bubble Bowl move in order to hear the sound. So to do that, in the pause menu, you hold L and R. You're going to do X, Y, X, Y, X, X, Y, Y.
It's almost too pretty to break. Almost.
It's as simple as that. Now you actually have to do it pretty quickly to register, so it's not really as easy as I made it look. I mean, legitimately, I have been practicing. Do you want to see one of the hardest codes in the game? So to unlock hard mode, and I'm gonna have to read it here. L and R again. X, 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 Y, Y, X, 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 Y, X, Y, 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 X, Y, Y. I was gonna look cool. I was gonna say something really cool and then I dropped. It's fun.
Alright, let's go back to Jellyfish Fields, and really there isn't a whole lot left to look at here. As SpongeBob continues his trek up the mountain, you'll notice that the pufferfish launching cannon was originally just a bunch of hammer enemies, and they are definitely not supposed to be there yet. The introduction cutscene is just a little bit past the cannons. You know the cutscene, the one where the robot just demolishes this dude, who is still in this early footage, just much earlier in the stage, right after the first bridge. And I guess he's right next to a hammer enemy too, so it is possible that the robot's introduction was meant to happen here, right after the bridge, instead of further up the mountain. Next, SpongeBob takes this opportunity to use his Bubble Bowl move on these wooden tikis, and it looks pretty unfinished. The area around it looks the same though, except for missing rocks, goo, and the bowling area. And there's also a tartar robot, or I guess tartar, because there's a dash there. Well anyway, like the hammer that we talked about earlier, it was not supposed to be here this early in the level. And last on our journey through this densely packed IGN footage is the Jellyfish Fields slide, presented by Mermaid Man. Or at least that's who it should have been. But no, in this build, Larry's here instead. Now the slide itself, unlike a lot of areas that we've already looked at, actually does have a difference. The secret path here requires a jump in the final version to reach, but in this build it does not. Boom bam, IGN footage done. Holy frick, that was long.
So that was all the B-roll footage from IGN. For being like 4.5 minutes long, that thing had a lot of freaking info. But we're not done with early footage yet. You know how in the GameCube era there used to be like these game trailers packed in with games, like how Luigi's Mansion had Pikmin trailers, or how Lego Batman had... Well, it turns out a lot of the Nick games had trailers for Battle for Bikini Bottom, at least ones that were released during the development of the game. In total, we've got a couple more minutes of footage, since a lot of them reuse footage from the IGN build, just in a little bit higher quality. So let's take a look at that, shall we?
Okay, so like I said, we've got a couple minutes of new early footage, but we also happen to have some higher quality clips from what we've already seen in the IGN footage, like this zoom of Patrick, this bit of Sandy in the air, SpongeBob in his house, this shot of Patrick running, this bit of SpongeBob respawning, Patrick opening the shiny object gate, SpongeBob with Squidward, SpongeBob rolling around near the Krusty Krab. And speaking of the Krusty Krab, thanks to this higher quality, we get a nice look at those spatulas all lined up in front of the restaurant. And there's also a bunch in front of the police station too. Now, of course, it's not just footage that we've already seen. Here we get to take a look at Sandy's tree dome for the first time. But the only difference here is that they forgot to put the wheel on the door. So I guess SpongeBob's never leaving here. Oh well. Also, if we take a look back at Industrial Park, Robo Patrick's finally here and ready to fight, though his toxic ice cream attack thingy isn't glowing in this version. And it doesn't look like Sandy's Texan lasso hook thingies are here either. Either that or just the camera's more zoomed in than normal. And speaking of Sandy, next up we've got Sandy's Texan slide, which looks pretty much the same, but SpongeBob can't slide here like the footage shows because of this swing that needs to be made at the beginning, which is impossible to do. I think. I've tried a couple million times myself with no luck, but you never know what speedrunners are capable of. I mean, speedrunners are known for finding lots of ways to exploit games, so I don't know. Maybe this jump could be nothing to them. Oh, and I almost forgot. SpongeBob managed to get his toes back. Huh. That's not a sentence I ever thought I'd have to say. Let's forget that happened and move on to downtown Bikini Bottom, alright? Right. Here we're missing a lot of objects. The fence, the arrow, the sign, the dude, SpongeBob's house, the lamppost. It's pretty barren here, to be honest. But the world itself looks pretty much the same. Seems like for a lot of this footage, the main topography is pretty much done. It's just the objects that are far from being finished. The UI also has parts that aren't quite finished yet. Like, check out this checkpoint text that shows up when SpongeBob walks towards that placeholder shiny object gate. Also, can we just take a moment to appreciate this beautiful, up close and personal look at an early shiny object? Just look at that. It's a purple square with text on it. Genius! At this point in the video, we've looked at 2 of the 3 trailers for the game, the third of which has footage from a build much closer to the final game. But the explosions on the robots are pretty different, and there's also this strange toy teeth icon above the sign, instead of it being like the button you need to press. It's really weird, and I don't like it. If we just move past that, after Patrick throws the melon and gets launched, he does this sick trick that was removed from the final version. Other than that, there are some texture changes, like buttons, instead of having hands on them, just say push, which is still left over in the final game. Plus, we can also see Sandy's boss health meter, which has a different texture too. This one is not in the final game though, sadly.
Now, I bet you think we've seen all the trailers now, right? No, we actually have a commercial with early footage of the game that we need to watch. And for the sake of this video not being like extremely long, let's just watch it right now.
The battle for Bikini Bottom in 15 seconds. Bikini Bottom was a level place, but now it isn't. Evil Plankton is taking it over. SpongeBob has to say that that's in turn for him. Why is he doing that? Can't get into that now. It's a new SpongeBob video game, and it's on a bunch of different game systems, and it's rated everywhere.
We're getting kicked out of this apartment, aren't we?
From the brief glimpse we get, the only differences here are the lighter font and the Duplicatotron's controls, and also an early version of robo-SpongeBob's first phase. Though other than the health meter changing, there isn't much different, except for this giant thing on his hands. What is that? At first I thought it was like grabbing one of the platforms to chuck it at you, but no. If we take the camera and we move our focus to Robo-Bob's hand buttons, you'll notice that they're the same on both sides. So take a screenshot of this, zoom, enhance, stretch. There it is. That is the giant thing on its hand. It's literally just a giant deformed button that was most likely just a random little bug they decided to leave in the footage because no one's gonna notice.
I noticed.
At this point, you must be thinking that surely that was the last bit of early footage for us to look at. Okay, then what's left? Well, it turns out one last thing. Back in the day, a site called Video Detective uploaded almost 3 minutes of footage of Battle for Bikini Bottom. It's all just nice, clear, clean B-roll footage with no commentary and very little music. So we can actually hear some of the early sounds, like for picking up a shiny object, an early Bubble Bash sound, or sometimes just no sounds.
Ow!
And then other times you get to hear this monstrosity.
Rollerific.
Other than that, we've pretty much seen all the changes present here already, except for like 4 things. First up are the Tiki Explosions, which look much different than what the final shows us. We've also got the hammer, but in this version of the cutscene, the body is see-through, likely due to an issue with the acid. And the text box for the instructions about diving have a very nice placeholder look to it. And then there's this last thing, the thing that finally answers the question that we've had since the beginning of this video. What is the deal with the peanut butter? Was it from Kelp Forest or Jellyfish Fields? Well, even though the art looks like Kelp Forest, it was indeed Jellyfish Fields, as originally King Jellyfish's health meter was peanut butter, or I guess technically peanut butter. And also, I didn't notice this until just now, but King Jellyfish's shower curtains have peanut butter drawings on them too, even in the final game. So yeah, that pretty much settles it. Peanut butter looks to have been the original antidote that you would have tried to get for Squidward before being replaced with King Jellyfish Jelly.
And that is all of the footage we've got.
Well, it turns out we've got one more thing. Early PS2 footage of the game, though it's mostly the same stuff. The lasso pointer is still an arrow and the Tikis are still using the old design, but there are other differences like fish NPCs in the hub area, pressure plates that say step on this to make sure you absolutely know what to do, and King Jellyfish's animations are a bit wonky too, but the most interesting thing of all, mime reveal. And also an early logo, which is still pretty cool, but not as cool as the mime.
And that is all the footage we've got, right? Right. Well, okay. There are still 2 early demo versions of the game that were actually released to the public. One was from the PS2 demo disc
2-12 Spring 2004 version.
and the other one was from Xbox Magazine January 2004. Now, I personally went through the Xbox demo myself, and there wasn't really that much to look at. Even in the files of it, there wasn't really much, just because it only includes the first 2 sections of Jellyfish Fields, and that's basically it. Well, actually, there is something interesting we could talk about. It's a file called sb.ini, which controls a bunch of various things in the game.
There's things like cheats that make you invincible, there's initial shiny object values, camera settings, fruit bounciness, move speeds, gravity settings, etc, etc. There's also some very interesting settings here that go unused, like E3 move speeds, special move settings left over from Scooby-Doo Night of 100 Frights, plus settings for the scrapped Sunday power-up, which is where we learned that it would last for 10 seconds and increase power by 1.5 times. Plus there's also some debug settings for recording footage that I couldn't get to work, but hey, at least I can do this.
Hey, that's pretty cool.
I should mention that this config file isn't exclusive to this demo, it's also in the final game, so basically, in short, in summary, this demo doesn't really have that much to it. Now the other demo, the PS2 one, yeah, it's pretty much in the same boat as the Xbox one. Most of the files are dated after the final build of the game, so the differences are very not here. Except there are some files that were from June 25th, 2003, and in those, we can find early save icons, which are way crustier than the ones the final game uses. The differences that we do see here though, are pretty much all the ones we've already seen from earlier footage, like Sandy's early boss health meter, a brighter Kelp Forest, and we've even got Steam in the Robo-Patrick fight. But there is one thing that is so incredibly interesting. This crusty JPEG shows us an unused phase of the Robo-SpongeBob fight that I've been purposely putting off to the end since it's just so freaking interesting.
I bet some of y'all thought I forgot. I didn't forget. I take my researching job seriously. If I missed this, freaking this whole video would have been a wash. Now let's get back to that giant robotic kitchen sponge wearing a Speedo with muscle inflatable thingies.
So back when we were looking at early footage, I skipped over one, tiny bit that was in pretty much every single trailer. This barely even 1 second clip of a scrapped final boss phase. And to start our journey into this, why don't we talk about all that we currently know about this muscular phase of the Robo-SpongeBob fight. In the final game, remember how after you blow up these dots, Robo-Plankton will give Robo-SpongeBob inflatable anchor arms. This was the point that the next phase was set to begin, with SpongeBob fighting Robo-SpongeBob Muscle Buff Pants. Though I'm not exactly sure how Plankton changed him from wearing pants to a Speedo. And that is really all the info we can get from this footage alone. But lucky for us, a lot, and I mean a lot of assets for this fight are still in the game's files, and we can put it back in the game with just a little tweaking to make sure it doesn't crash. So, Muscle Bob has 2 attacks. One is a jumping attack that shoots out a shockwave, and the other has him slamming into the ground with the anchor arms. Neither of these do any damage though when put in game, but I'm fairly confident when I say it was supposed to hurt. Now, during the slam attack, Patrick is able to throw some rocks from around the area at the arms themselves to deflate them, which is all good and fine, except for the fact that it doesn't end the battle, so it just goes on forever. Also, it is kinda weird that Patrick is the one who's supposed to beat the boss, since in the early footage, it shows SpongeBob fighting him. Not to mention, SpongeBob is in the files for this battle too, but obviously can't do much since you have to pick up objects to win, and he can't do that. There's also a model for a dumbbell, which uses part of a texture called Weight Machine, both of which can't be seen in the level. And there are also NPCs too, like Mr. Krabs, which is weird since he isn't in any of the cutscenes leading up to this point, so I don't exactly know why he'd be here. There's also data for Robo-Plankton, other robots, and even some Bikini Bottom citizens who may have been there to cheer you on. But we don't know that for sure since they aren't actually placed in the world. And that's the battle. Sure is a lot here, but as you know, they completely scrapped this phase and just had SpongeBob skip ahead from the first phase right into the Robo Head one. And speaking of the Robo Head phase, according to Alex Chavez, who was an artist on the game, we now have some early info on this place too. Apparently, instead of a laser cannon, Plankton was going to shoot snot. Yeah, that was his original attack. Making snot splatter decals was one of Alex's earliest tasks on the game's development cycle. That idea, honestly, thankfully, was scrapped. Though you can see this weird green goo in some places around here. I don't know if that has anything to do with it, but it does look gross, so maybe. But you know, I never did answer the question, why? Not in relation to the scrapped attack, but why was this boss condensed and an entire phase removed? Well, it's pretty simple, really. They needed more time to develop it, and they did not have that. Time was running out and they needed to scrap something, and this just so happened to be one of the things that was on the chopping block. According to the files in the game, the last time the scrap phase was touched by developers was on August 7th, 2003, which is a little more than a month before the first phase of the battle was finalized. So it seems like they really tried to get this in, but in the end they just ran out of time. Rest in peace, Mr. Muscle Bob. Rest in peace.
All right, folks, we made it. We have reached the time to start looking at unused findings in Battle for Bikini Bottom. I mean, I guess technically we've already seen, a few of them, but that just like scrapes the tip of the iceberg. Is that a saying? It's probably a saying. Basically, we've still got plenty more to look at, like, for instance, these leftover cinematics from Scooby-Doo Night of 100 Frights, as well as some other leftover text as well, but I don't really want to dwell too much on the leftovers. What unused text in Battle for Bikini Bottom was meant for Battle for Bikini Bottom? Well, let's just take a look then. And I actually have our first piece of unused text lovingly written out on this sheet of paper for absolutely no reason. It was meant to be said by our bubbly friend Bubble Buddy, so let's see what our good pal has to say. Welcome to my nightmare. Hey, the hench, thou spongy freak? What about get out of here? Didn't you understand I said beat it? Thanks for leaving me alone. Repeat as needed. Well done, SpongeBob. Now die?
Yeah, that's some real creepypasta-like stuff, isn't it? But of course it wasn't meant to be in the game. It seems like someone was just trying to have a little bit of fun while testing text fields. To be honest, there is a lot of weird text that goes unused in this game. So let's look at some of that unused text. If we skip over things like compiler logs and build information, we can find a handful of text that was meant just as chit-chat between the developers. Like how Dan K said he'll come over and hurt me if I delete a file called aura2.png.
Oh gosh.
There's other much less ominous text referring to Dan 2, as well as Ryan and Neil, two other game programmers for Battle for Bikini Bottom. Or, I'm sorry, according to this text, the game's actual name is SpongeBob When Robots Attack. Seems like this could have been the original name for the game before Battle for Bikini Bottom was decided on, but there's actually an even earlier name found in some early Nickelodeon sales documents, where it called it SpongeBob Mechanical Mischief, right next to River Deep's SpongeBob Typing, which I did have as a kid. I remember it being fun, so let's take a quick look.
Hello? What's this? What's all the racket? This cash register is broken and I can't get me money out.
Huh. Now how about we look at some text that had to do with game tasks, like getting golden spatulas. Turns out Sandy's Dream Slide was originally going to be a time task that had to be beaten within 190 seconds. Some placeholder text alongside that shows what would have happened if you had succeeded or failed. And speaking of placeholder text, there happens to be some for the Robot Sandy and Robot Patrick boss battles, which told the player to press a button in order to leave after winning, instead of just auto-warping them out. Plus there's also some text that would have appeared when each new round started too. Turns out though, Robo Sandy and Robo Patrick happen to have different names in some of the unused text. You know how each task has its own title in the game? Well, Robo Sandy's one, called Rumble at the Poseidon, was originally called Defeat Sandy Boss Bot. In fact, all the early names for these bosses followed the same format, like Patrick Boss Bot and SpongeBob Boss Bot, except SpongeBob has one more early name, specifically to be used during the scrapped muscle phase of the boss battle, Robo SpongeBob Muscle Pants. That is the official name for this phase of the battle. And along with these early task names, we can also learn that the Myrmilator was originally called Barnacle Cave, the Swing Along Spatula task was called A Leap of Faith from the Slide, the SpongeBob Arena is referred to as the Playground in various files, and then there's this task, which isn't in the final game at all. It's called Screaming for Ice Cream. And I bet you already know what this task was going to be for. I mean, there's only one ice cream based level in the dream world. Yeah, that's right, Patrick's Scrap Dream. At this point, I do want to take a closer look at the playground, or SpongeBob Arena. Turns out there's some unused warp text in Bikini Bottom for the arena, where it refers to it as the playground, though the file name for this references the wrong level, referring to PG01 instead of the final ID for the arena, PG12. You know, I guess I kind of just threw out a bunch of info at once, didn't I? Let me break it down. First off, what are warps? Basically, whenever you use a gate or a door or almost anything that takes you to a new area, that's a warp. And that text that tells you what button to press, that's the warp text. And the fact that the warp was going to take you to PG01 instead of the final PG12 means that there would have been around 12 test rooms, with only the 12th one being included in the game for the players to play around in. Now, I do want to say that there are plenty more unused warp texts. First, we've got a couple for the Barnacle Caves, the Myrmilator, and we've also got a few for SpongeBob's house too, like for the attic, the bedroom, the living room, and outside. But the way that the outside one is phrased, go back outside, it makes it seem like the game wouldn't have started in SpongeBob's house, but instead outside of it in Bikini Bottom, and then the player would go inside and then back outside. Turns out though, that's not true. According to Joel Goodsell, the game's lead designer, the scrapped go back outside text was part of a scrapped idea where warps would have different text depending on different circumstances. This is the way that Joel put it. The go outside versus go back outside was just a simplification of the branching logic based on whether it was really necessary to have two different messages. We always started inside SpongeBob's house. A lot of simplification is based on, is it necessary to make this feature great? Or will putting that effort elsewhere make something else great that really needs to be? Pretty interesting, huh? You know what else is interesting? This early warp text for when you complete the Flying Dutchman's boss battle, where it says to bubble bounce on the bounce pad to return to the entrance area. Now, there are two things about that. One, there is no bounce pad there in the final game. Instead, a boat takes you back to the first area in the graveyard. And second, it tells the player that they have to specifically use the bubble bounce move on the bounce pad to return to the entrance, which is weird, because there's nowhere in the final game that doing that will cause a warp to happen. But this isn't the only piece of unused text that says bubble bouncing on these trampolines does something special. If you manage to clip through the lighthouse in downtown Bikini Bottom rooftops, you'll find a signpost just hanging out that says this. If you bubble bounce this springboard, it will spring you higher than normal. So originally these springboards or bounce pads or trampolines or whatever the heck they're called, they were originally going to let the player bounce higher than normal, sometimes even warping them to new areas when they did the bubble bounce move on them. But there is nowhere in the final game where this feature is enabled, not that I remember from being a kid. Well, it turns out that's not entirely true. In fact, another way to put it is, that's not true at all. There is one trampoline that does this. It's behind the food and drink stalls in Goo Lagoon Pier. First though, you gotta kind of finagle your way back there, where you'll find a few shiny objects to reward your curiosity, along with this mystical trampoline, which is really only here because the player, without it, can't get out. They have to jump into the goo to continue on with the level. But if you do get back there and bubble bounce on that trampoline, it will send you a much higher in the air than normal, just like that sign inside the lighthouse said. So this special trampoline function isn't technically unused, but that's only because the devs accidentally left the function enabled on one single trampoline in the final game, even after they scrapped the feature. Now, signs are cool and all, but what about some unused text that's said by an actual character in the game? Not to worry, there is plenty of that too. Quite a bit of it is just placeholder stuff though, nothing too interesting. Well, except for this line said by Larry in Sandy's dream. Well said, Larry. Of course, there is more than just placeholder dialogue here. There's some stuff that was definitely meant to be said by some characters in the game, but for some reason or another was cut. Most of the times on purpose, but not this one though. This one line went unused completely by accident. At the beginning of the game, after getting out of SpongeBob's house, you'll find Bubble Buddy, who teaches you how to destroy flying tikis. After going through that tutorial and talking to him again, he'll simply remind you that you need to press that button and you both move on with your life. But that wasn't how it was supposed to be. SpongeBob was supposed to say after that, "Gotcha, Bubble Buddy." I'm sorry, my SpongeBob impression is awful. Why don't we just hear the actual voice actor do it?
Gotcha, Bubble Buddy.
So why was this text scrapped? Why doesn't it show up? Well, that's because SpongeBob's line was accidentally put into a completely new text asset. And you can even see the asset's name is part of the code to make the text work.
And we can easily fix this with this beautiful program known as Industrial Park, a Battle for Bikini Bottom editing tool created by the legend known as Igor Seabra4. So here we are in Bikini Bottom, and here's Bubble Buddy over here. All we gotta do is go to the HIP file and find Bubble Buddy reminder text. And here's that broken text asset. Let's open the edit window and the header window as well. Now watch this. We simply copy and paste the asset name into the reminder text asset. Replace the underscore with a semicolon, seeing as semicolons can't be used in names. Then we just add a question mark to the end and then copy and paste the data from the other text asset. All right, let's see if it works.
Don't forget.
Gotcha, Bubble Buddy.
There we freaking go. That took like what, 30 seconds? I mean, it's not like they couldn't have fixed it. It's just no one knew it was a problem. I mean, honestly, if we hadn't looked through the files, no one would have known it. This small piece of unused text would have been lost to history.
You know, since I've already got Industrial Park open, I might as well just put the rest of the unused dialogue we have to look at back in the game, you know, so that way we have some nice comparisons. And on that note, let's check out some more of that scrapped dialogue. We'll start by going over to the box office in Bikini Bottom and talk to the guy working there. Normally we don't get much dialogue here, just a "may I help you" followed by a generic prompt. But going unused in the game's files is an entire conversation between SpongeBob and this dude. There is so much scrapped here that the dialogue that made it into the final game just feels like an early version of what actually went unused. So basically like flipped. Like the final version seems like it should be unused and the unused version seems like it should be in the final game. And that might not be that far off, because the unused text asset is called Bo Attendant or Box Office Attendant _begin_text, which sounds normal. It fits the file name standard of pretty much everything else NPC related. The text asset that is used though all starts with Boat Attendant Original. It's not only misspelled, it's also called original, and unlike any other naming convention used in the rest of the game. I mean, it sure seems like the text used in the final game was the original early dialogue, but if that's the case, why was it kept in? Why was such nice, well-written dialogue left unused? I don't know. I really don't know. It could be just because, you know, it's a small character and they didn't want to give him too many lines, but if that's the case, poor guy. My friend, you deserve better. And while we're here, let me tell you another way that this guy was screwed over. He only gets a few voice lines in the game, but they still felt the need to scrap one of them. And it's a very interesting one, because it mentions that you would have originally been able to view past cinematics in the theater and not just concept art.
Each time you see a new movie, it will appear here on this list for you to view again at your own leisure.
Okay, why don't we check out Jellyfish Fields now? There's two things I want to mention here dialogue-wise, the first of which is when Patrick talks to Mr. Krabs at Jellyfish Lake. Well, it turns out it was originally going to be SpongeBob talking to him, and it's fully voiced too.
Ahoy there, SpongeBob! Squidward tells me you're looking for the king jellyfish.
Yes, sir, Mr. Krabs.
Good thing, too. That monster has been stinging all my good customers in their poop decks. I hear that you can find him up top of Old Sport Mountain here. Go hook that beast, sailor!
Aye, Mr. Krabs.
In the final game, the conversation is pretty much the same, but of course with Patrick instead. But the interesting thing is that Patrick's voice lines that are used here are used in other places in the game too.
Oh boy, Mr. Krabs. I'll see what I can do.
So it's possible that this change to have Patrick talk with Mr. Krabs instead of SpongeBob could have happened last minute, and then they didn't have the time or perhaps even the money for Patrick's voice actor to record new lines, so they just, you know, borrow clips from elsewhere. The other thing I want to talk about in Jellyfish Fields happens to be the cutscenes, the ones with SpongeBob and King Jellyfish. Turns out there's dialogue for these scenes as if they weren't going to be cutscenes at all. The first part isn't too interesting, it's the same as the final cutscene, but in text form basically. But the dialogue from after the fight differs quite a bit from the cutscene. See, instead of King Jellyfish grabbing the jelly, tossing it over to SpongeBob and leaving for vacation, the unused dialogue has SpongeBob say,
Whoa, that was close.
and then King Jellyfish spits up jar of jellyfish jelly.
I could do a bit for this, but no, that sounds, no.
All right, off to the dream worlds we go. We still got quite a bit more unused dialogue to check out, but first, fun fact, Did you know that Bubble Buddy is right here in SpongeBob's dream, but you just can't see him? If we literally just rename him using the Industrial Park editor, he appears complete with a task for us to do. Now, what is this task? I have no freaking idea. I tried collecting all the gold spatulas, nothing. I tried collecting all the socks, nothing. I tried using a cheat to give myself 200 spatulas, still nothing. I downloaded a 200% complete save file and oh my gosh, the task is finished. Are you kidding me? I literally collected every single collectible in SpongeBob's Dream World by hand. It didn't do anything. But now it's just, it's, okay, no. There's one last thing I want to look at in the Dream World, specifically in Patrick's ice cream dream. Here you'll find Mrs. Puff at the entrance, and it sure seems like you'd be able to talk to her, right? Well, yeah, you're right. You should be able to talk to her. I mentioned her before, but now I want to go into a bit more detail. She's missing her task box. That's why you can't talk to her. Basically, whenever an NPC has a task for you, they have something called a task box, which points to different text assets for whenever you fail, succeed, whatever. It also points to something called a talk box too, which includes settings like, should the player be allowed to quit the conversation? And see, here's the thing, all the text for Mrs. Puff is right here, but the talk and text boxes aren't, so she won't talk to you. I did get it to work though. I just kind of like duct taped a fix in the game so that way we could at least see the conversation in action, even if these assets had to be, forced in to make it work. I'll let you read this for a little bit, though it's not really much more than Mrs. Puff trying her best to talk with Patrick, him going, blah, 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 blah. And then Mrs. Puff will just ask, please just get the spatula. She even has some reminder text too in case you just really need to be reminded about this. And also text for success after you succeed, and text for failure. But sadly, even if you collect that golden spatula, you can't finish the task, so yeah.
So that's quite a bit of unused text on, but we still got a little bit more, but very little. We only have 3 more things. Sunday, stall key, and bus ticket. Those are 3 unused names for pickups in the game's executable, and they don't have any files associated with them, so we can't even see them in game. Except for the Sunday. That one's obvious. We've already seen it in the game. All the files are there for that, but not for stall key and bus ticket. In fact, we've actually got nothing we can learn about it. We're pretty much stuck if there's no files in the game, right? Well, we were.
There is actually something we can learn about these 2 scrap pickups, thanks to a little help from Joffrey. So what's there to learn? Well, for stall key, not a whole lot. Even Joffrey didn't remember that much about it. In fact, he thinks it might have just been a temp name for something different, but doesn't know what. Now, for bus tickets, he did remember something very interesting. Apparently, there was a point in development where in order to swap characters at the bus stop, you needed to collect a bus ticket. Of course, in the final game, you don't need a ticket. You just walk up to the thing and you can swap at will. But I guess at first, it was going to be a bit more difficult than that, requiring you to scour the level for a ticket before you could play as someone other than SpongeBob.
And that was all of the unused text and text-based dialogue that we're going to look at, but there's still some unused voice clips that don't have any text associated with them at all. In fact, there are quite a few of them, and we're going to take a deep dive in there. Not too deep though, because there are, as I said, quite a few of them. Now, over 20 of them happen to be from an earlier build of the game where SpongeBob and his playable friends would comment on the bosses that they were facing. Now, none of that appears in the final game, so I'm not sure if this was supposed to play before the boss fight or maybe even during it. But here's the thing. Some of the characters who aren't even going to be able to fight the boss in the final game still have unused voice clips reacting to it, so let's take a listen.
Wow, King Jellyfish, the grandest granddaddy jellyfish of them all, and he's after me!
Oh, that's the biggest, scariest jellyfish I've ever seen!
You're just a bag full of jelly.
A giant sandy robot! I'm doomed.
That's the biggest Sandy I've ever seen, except when she was hibernating.
Well, don't that beat all?
He looked a lot bigger on TV.
Come on out and fight like a crustacean!
Prawn, I'm bringing you in.
The bigger they are, the harder they hit.
Wow! I'm huger than normal today!
He may be shinier than the real Patrick, but he's not any brighter.
Oh, I'm being shanghaied!
Please don't Shanghai me, Mr. Dutchman.
Mr. Dutchman, you just got on my last nerve.
Oh, this is so creepy.
I don't think this is good.
Good gracious, but that's Sponge big!
As if the small version weren't enough.
He's only big if you think he is.
That's the orneryest robot yet!
Now for SpongeBob, we happen to have a few more reactions, but this time for golden spatulas.
Have you ever seen a more perfect spatula of shiny golden goodness? Wow, really? For me? Oh, you shouldn't have. Victory screech! Oh!
There also happen to be voice lines for every single character reacting to Tikis. Now we've already seen the ones for the flying lovey-dovey Tikis, but since we're here, let's take a listen to the rest of them.
Okay, that's creepy.
Ooh, wooden presents.
Stop your staring at me.
Gotta watch out for the boom.
Uh-oh, this one goes boom.
Like a Texas thunderstorm.
I'll just sneak up on him.
I don't sneak very well.
Cowardly little fellas.
Now how to get this one open?
Hard as a rock.
Them's tough nuts to crack.
Now it's possible these voice lines were removed because if they played every single time you saw a Tiki, it could get, a bit
Okay.
repetitive. Now, interestingly enough, there happen to be some unused voice clips that aren't even new voice clips at all. I mean, they're different recordings of the same line, like with a different inflection, like, hey, how's it going, versus, hey, how's it going? Now, normally that wouldn't mean, that big of a difference, but there is one that makes a huge difference. You remember that famous Mrs. Puff line from the game?
Don't ask questions you aren't prepared to handle the answer to.
Yeah, that one. Now here it is with the unused inflection.
Don't ask questions you aren't prepared to handle the answers to.
See what I mean? She went from like a reasonable, nice teacher to being one that just freaking, in a snap, becomes completely unhinged. And that's actually pretty on brand for the character. Out of all of these unused clips though, there is one that I think is the most interesting, and it takes place in the Myrmilator. It's an unused conversation between SpongeBob and Mermaid Man that seemingly maybe could be possibly be implying that it wasn't just Patrick who can throw fruits, but also SpongeBob.
But Mermaid Man, you're the best thrower there is.
True, but I already threw something.
What?
I just threw out my back!
To finish off here, let's check out a few generic unused sounds. They're not voice lines, and they are perhaps the most ear-grating sounds I have ever heard on this channel. Let me share these with you. Okay, so first is the death sound for the monsoon enemy. Okay, next is an early version of the bubble feet move. This next sound is potentially an early version for collecting a golden spatula. Oh, that one wasn't too bad. Okay, this last one is for the buzzbot enemies, and it's just a clapping. Ow. Okay, no, I'm good. Next, I want to take a bit of time talking about something called triggers, which are basically invisible objects that when touched will do something. There's a lot of unused ones scattered through the game's levels, and most were just meant for debugging purposes and were disabled, but not removed from the final version. For instance, there's a trigger above where you spawn when leaving SpongeBob's house, and if we enable it, it'll prompt you to press R1 in order to enter the playground. Now, we already know that the playground is called PG01 internally, but this trigger points to a different level, TL01, which sadly isn't in the game, so even if you press the button once, it will freeze. Also inside that trigger is another disable trigger that after touching will enable a cheat that allows SpongeBob to enter the theater without spending a single shiny object. If we head over to Jellyfish Fields, you can find a trigger from E3 way outside the field of play. So far out that even if you enable it, you're not gonna get very far without Han stepping in. So I moved it over here. And if you walk into it, you instantly turn into Patrick with a text box appearing showing that, yeah, this is an E3 demo feature. It's basically just there to let you try out throwing fruit, and if you leave the area, boop, you're right back to SpongeBob. Moving on to Rock Bottom, there are 5 disabled, unused triggers that were all meant for testing purposes, like getting free artwork, free shiny objects. This one over here opens the gate up there, though I kinda had to move the trigger because it was in the wall. And then there's one for arming the lasers near Plankton. Now here's a fun little game to bust out at a party. Which trigger is the one that starts these lasers? Is it test cheat trig, or is it test lasers? If you said test cheat trig, you're right, because the test lasers does nothing with the lasers. If you get inside that trigger, all it does is poof out smoke. But specifically, the smoke that appears when the laser shoots the rock, so there is a bit of a connection with the name. Now there is one more unused trigger at the beginning of Rock Bottom, but I didn't include it with the other 5 because it's technically labeled as a pickup, and even has a shiny object model attached to it so we can see it in game with a little free cam work. Let me just get over there with a bit of cheating, and after picking up this pickup, which is called Test Puff Success, there's no longer a need to collect any artwork. Mrs. Puff will just give us the golden spatula without questioning a thing. Now in SpongeBob's dream, the trigger that's used to enter Patrick's dream has a little secret to it. Turns out inside that trigger is another disabled trigger, which leads to Patrick's scrapped ice cream dream. So if we disable the used one and enable the unused one, it works just like it was meant to, with the ice cream dream front and center looking as beautiful as ever, unless you move the camera. I do want to say that just because most of these triggers are disabled doesn't mean that they all are. There are a few unused triggers that were left enabled just out of reach so that way you wouldn't hit them in normal gameplay. What the development team didn't count on though were speedrunners. Using some different techniques throughout the game, speedrunners are able to hit a variety of triggers that you aren't supposed to, like this one in the Myrmilator that ends Prawn's boss battle early, and a similar situation exists for the Flying Dutchman battle. Both of these triggers can be reached utilizing a little trickery, like using Cruise Boost, which is performed by using a cruise bubble and bubble bowl on the same frame twice when next to a wall, while doing a strafe in between both of those inputs. You got that? Well, now you can just forget all of it, because the next trigger doesn't utilize it at all. It's when fighting robo-spongebob, the first phase. All you gotta do here is stand on the right platform, get SpongeBob to karate chop it, and that's the end of the phase of the battle. Fantastic work.
All right, at this point we've looked at a lot of unused stuff. Well, I guess maybe look at is the wrong way to put it, because we've listened to a lot of clips, we've seen triggers, but they're also invisible, and why don't we look at something that we can actually look at? Unused graphics, and we can start with the UI. Now, a lot of it we've already seen because, it was in earlier footage like the anchor, the 2D shiny objects, the early golden spatula icon, but there are a few more interesting things. For instance, let's start with early unseen credits for the game that were meant mostly for developers to see, not us, but since they've already got it here, why don't we read it out loud, shall we? SpongeBob SquarePants in Battle for Bikini Bottom was made by Heavy Iron Studios. Houday, lead emailer Shiraz Akmal, General Mayhem Lyle Hall, art detector Jeff Berting, lead problem Jason Horner, gay designer Joel Goodsell, lead animosity The Geckland. Oh yeah, and a bunch of other dudes. Word. Sounds about right.
There's some other strange unused graphics in the game too, like this doodle of SpongeBob, which has a separate texture that goes with it in order to fill it with color. Now it looks a lot like the classic SpongeBob logo, but I'm not exactly sure what it was going to be used for. And the same goes for this unused Krabby Patty, unless it was collectible, which I guess is pretty likely. Now what about this? A bubble blowing bottle called UI Bubble Meter. I asked Joffrey about this one, and he said that as far as he recalls, this was meant to limit your bubble moves by reducing the meter after using a move, and collecting some kind of collectible would refill the bottle. It's kind of like in Super Mario Sunshine, where you can't use FLUDD unless you've got water and you can collect little bottles to fill it up. Here it's just like that. You couldn't use your bubble moves without bubble juice. Is that what that's called? Bubble juice? Guess it is. Other UI related stuff includes a couple of early text boxes, one of which was meant for signs, and the other was just a temporary one found in the Jellyfish Fields assets. And now quickly moving away from UI, there's some placeholder textures that we can check out too, like this one for platforms in Rock Bottom's museum, some sandy arrows meant for tongue sliding, told you I was gonna say that word again, a really crusty flag that was kept along with the pressure pads, and this X, which was used to tell the player, hey, you can bubble bash this, and was replaced with a much nicer icon in the final build. Now, this X does have a bit more to it. It's found in a folder called New Folder, meaning they didn't even bother to name this one, so there's gotta be more unused textures for us to look at in there, right? Yeah, there is. Just one more. One more unused texture in this folder called Fruit Leaves, and it gives us some interesting info about the fruits Patrick can pick up. Turns out they were going to be in more than one color. In fact, they were going to be a bunch of different colors, both inside the fruit, along with the leaves that surrounded it too. Now, for our final unused texture, I want to talk about Sky Cinematic Mourn. It's found in the intro cutscene. You know, the one where Plankton does all the things he does and SpongeBob and Patrick do all the things that they do, then they all go to bed and destruction of the world happens. Well, this texture was meant to be used when SpongeBob wakes up in the morning to see all the damage, and it's placed in the scene, but set to be invisible. So if we simply change the visibility flag to true, we can see what it was supposed to look like. But here's the interesting thing. This morning skybox is only used in the beginning part of the cutscene and the zoom out from the chum bucket, both of which happen at night. You'd think it would be in the, morning part of the cutscene. The part where it shows all the damage from the robot right before SpongeBob wakes up. But no, the one place it should be, it's not there. All right, those were the textures. But what about unused objects? We talked about a few of them already, like almost an hour ago at this point, but there's still plenty more to see. Take this worm for instance. Its model is found in Shady Shoals, but it's never actually put into the level itself. When you spawn this guy in, it has 4 animations, 2 of which are idle, 1 is for when hit by an attack, and the other is just walking, or I guess crawling. Now, what is this? Like, I know it's a worm, but why is it in the game? Well, that ring around it may be the key to solving this mystery. Because it's not a ring, it's a leash. Meaning that this could have been Mr. Krabs' worm, Mr. Doodle. Or I guess it technically could be Rex, who was SpongeBob's worm for like 20 seconds in the dumped episode. Either way, it is an untextured pet NPC worm that for some reason can only be found in Shady Shoals. Now there are some more unused NPCs found in the game too, like these 2 fish, whose models each have an unused beach variant. There's also an early raft guy here whose only difference is different colored pants and not wearing a shirt. Now wait a second, zoom, enhance here? Okay, sorry, he is wearing a shirt, but it's the exact same color as his skin. I can see why they changed that. Next, let's take a look at this early Thunder Tiki, which is included with Patrick's Ice Cream Dreams files, and can be seen in this very early screenshot. Though it looks to be like frozen or something, because instead of being, bright red, it's blue. Wait, no, that's not right. We already talked about this. It was blue in the Goo Lagoon footage, so there's no way that these are frozen. You can't be like frozen on the beach. And we can confirm this thanks to this piece of concept art, where we also get to see some interesting looks for the other tikis, especially the lovey-dovey one. The screenshot from before also shows us one of the highest quality views of the super early shiny objects. Though I haven't mentioned it yet, there is another early version of shiny objects unused in the game's files that's a mixture of the blocky ones with the text and the final flower design. You can see them in action in this early screenshot, one that I remember like distinctly from my childhood.
And this is where I remember it the most, the summer 2003 free Take One Nintendo booklet of just like a bunch of different games. Wow. And there it is, right there. They didn't even have a logo for it at the time, did they? It was just SpongeBob SquarePants, fresh from the Frossus, F-A-R-C-A-S. Let's listen.
Freakus.
Freakus? I love that!
Other than that, there's not a whole lot left to see. We've got an exit sign that was meant for Sand Mountain, which is still in the final game, just invisible, and named after the playground for some reason. Plus, there's also a version of the taxi used in the game, but modeled on both sides instead of just one. Not to mention, get this, Squidward's model comes with a clarinet, but he never holds it or plays it or anything like that. It's just there, but it never gets used, so you never see it. And speaking of Squidward's model, not only is there an unused clarinet attached to it, but he also has an unused walking animation too. In fact, so does Mr. Krabs, and Mrs. Puff, and Bubble Buddy, Gary, Larry, Mermaid Man, Barnacle Boy, even Plankton, though his animation is a bit crusty compared to the others. So why did all these walking animations go unused? Well, it's because none of them walk in the final game. NPCs in Battle for Bikini Bottom pretty much just always stood in the same place outside of, cutscenes. So were NPCs originally supposed to walk around? Surprisingly, no. The answer to this question comes right from the director of the game, Shiraz himself. Usually an animator would generate the basic character cycles, walk, idle, etc. So that way if we chose to use it, we could, or use them in cinematics, cutscenes, though those tended to be custom animations the whole way through. A lot of the characters were signposts effectively to direct you and triggered the UI box. So in short, these were all made for a just-in-case scenario that never happened. Shiraz mentioned more than just walking animations were generated, but also idle and other generic animations too. And on that note, here are some unused idle animations for Bubble Buddy, and a scared walking animation for Mermaid Man. Or I guess running would have been a better term to say it, scared running animation. Mrs. Puff also has a couple of scared idle animations, or at the very least, they make me scared. And they go completely unused. Now we can't forget about the star of the show, SpongeBob SquarePants, who has an interesting unused walking animation that was later used in the movie game while he's drunk on ice cream, of course. There also happens to be unused idle animations for the bosses too, like Robo-Spongebob doing a little dance, And there's even one for Patrick, standing there, menacingly. Oh wait, I already used that joke, dang it. Sandy also happens to have an unused idle animation that can only be found in the files for Patrick's scrapped ice cream dream, which is starting to become a big treasure trove of unused stuff at this point. Plus there's an animation of Sandy getting hit as an NPC, and the only place in the final game where Sandy is an NPC is in the tree dome. But there she's wearing a swimsuit and is also a completely different model, so this animation was not meant for there. Turns out, it was meant for the unused robo-spongebob anchor arms phase, where she would have stood on the side as an NPC and would have been able to get hit. And speaking of getting hit, not only does Sandy have an unused hit animation, but so does the mime outside the Krusty Krab. Now, was that interesting enough to be worth mentioning in the video? No. Nah, who am I kidding? This is such a nice animation, I couldn't leave it out. Now, how about we check out the opposite of nice animations, like, oh, I don't know, nightmare-inducing animations? Well, have I got you covered? Let's take a look at some absolutely terrifying unused animations from Mr. Musclepants. In total, there are 3 of these to look at, and we'll be stepping up the fear factor each time. All right, first we have the robot man kissing his giant muscles, or less like kissing and more like just stretching his lips. Okay, that's not too bad. Then we've got this funny little animation of his arms, which were deflated, beating his chest. I personally am not a fan of the arms. And if you agree with me on that, I hope you enjoy this last one. Here, Musclepants is, I guess, kissing his fingers and looking at his deflated... Okay, we're done here.
Well, we've made it to the end, everyone. Congratulations, you did it! Well, I've only got one thing left to show you, but it's pretty darn good. It's in the files for Goo Lagoon. In fact, there are actually 2 folders in there that go unused. One is called New Folder, and the other is called Working. Now, both of them don't get any use, but inside them are 2 early versions of Goo Lagoon. One was dated May 11th, 2003, and the other one was built on May 12th, 2003, so 1 day apart. But that is more than 4 months before the final build date. Now, to get it back in the game, it does take a bit of finagling. And you can thank Minecraft Freak 73 for that one, and MK2 for sending it my way. Thank you both. In fact, thank you to the whole modding community for making just all of this possible. Now, what do you say we head to the beach?
So this is an early Goo Lagoon. And to give you a time frame of when this was made, the E3 footage of Goo Lagoon that we saw at the very beginning of this video was shown just a few days after this version of the level was built. So it's safe to say that the build that we saw at E3 and this unused version are going to be fairly similar. But hey, now we can actually walk around and see some stuff up close, so let's get going. The first thing you're probably going to notice here are those early tikis, now fully animated and ready to be destroyed. There's also some familiar sights like buttons saying push on them, but only after you push them. This Gary sign was still being used back then instead of the question mark one. And not to mention the big old fish that we saw and used just a bit earlier, well, he's here now. There also happened to be some early toll gates with stop written on them, that early shiny object box, and not to mention the sauger ball that we've seen Patrick carry in early footage and screenshots, it's here too. I always wonder what would happen if you picked it up and time ran out, because you know, the fruit explodes in the final version. Does the ball explode here? Let's find out. And no, it just disappears. Great, okay, mystery solved. Looking around some more, I was also half expecting the hammers in this stage to use this unused attack animation, since it's found with the early Goo Lagoon files. But no, the final animation is already being used here. Though if we turn around and use the Bubble Bash move on this platform, we can get an early sound effect. Other than that, the lighting. Oh my gosh, is it different. I mean, I could tell something was different from the early footage, but I thought that might have been, you know, just bad quality. No, it turns out the lighting was just that flat originally, and the textures certainly don't help that. They look way more basic in this version, and sometimes they're even just missing entirely. I mean, look at the inside of the sandcastle side by side with the final version. The development team really put a lot of time and effort making this game sparkle and shine, and it shows. I mean, to be honest, despite some small differences here and there, the level layout in this early version isn't all that different from the release build. That means they spent an additional 4 months on what could already be considered an almost complete level just to make sure it looked as best as it could possibly be.
And I think that's why we all love Battle for Bikini Bottom so much. You can tell this wasn't like a simple cash grab like a lot of other licensed games out there. Battle for Bikini... Battle for Bikini Bottom is different. Like, there's a lot of love and passion in this game, from the writing, the animation, the story. Even when talking to the devs after all of these years after the game released, you can still tell the passion they had for it and the memories that they made along the way. They love this game, and I love it too, as well as many, many other people. So, honestly, cheers to you developers. Thank you so much for putting all that work in all those years ago and for helping me out in this video. Seriously, you made some of the best memories for me as a kid, and I'm sure for many other people too. This didn't work at all.
Well, hi there. I'd like to thank a few people, quite a few people. Minecraft Freak 73, Joey, Aaron 5015, Sheriff the Great, Double H, MK2. Thank you for reviewing the video, helping me out with things, and thank you especially to the devs. I know I've thanked you like 50 times in this video, but seriously, I couldn't have done this without you. And to all the patrons who have been supporting my dreams for the past year, you all are just awesome. Thank you. Have a good one.